of which he was their first president. John, go ahead and take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be with you. I never sure where this presentation will end up, so I want to give it a geographic um, location or perspective. So we're coming to you from central New Mexico. That's Bernalillo and Sandoval counties. And our elevation above sea level is 5,300 feet. And we get approximately 9 inches of precipitation a year. We have frequent drying winds, 4 seasons. We're moving into spring just now. And intense ultraviolet radiation, which is beginning already. So we're high and dry, and we're currently in significant drought conditions. Some parts of our counties go from moderate to severe to extreme drought. And the map you see on the right there is from 3/16 of 2021. Some of you probably are already involved in composting. That's wonderful. If you're not, I hope the presentation will answer some of your questions. So we'll talk about what is composting, how to do it, why do it, and how to use the end product. All of my pictures, by the way, are taken from the internet. They're not pictures that I have taken personally myself. So in the presentation, we'll consider climate impact, the composting recipe and composting science, containers and practice, both the cold and the hot process, and then management of the processes, static and active, and then using compost as a soil amendment. So as I said earlier, we have sparse rainfall here and therefore low humidity, frequent drying winds, and frequent sunshine. Intense ultraviolet radiation, as I said, it's already building up because we have clear skies and no clouds to block the sun. And then we have a day to night temperature fluctuation, sometimes 30 degrees difference. And this influences condensation of moisture. So we will come back to that after a while. And then of course we have seasonal temperature variation. So in general, composting operations will slow down in the winter and then pick up in the spring. So the formula that we're going to be working with, or the recipe, if you will, this science is planet-wide. It's the materials and management that are specific for the desert. So you have to adjust your composting practice to suit our desert climate needs. And that includes gardening practices also. And our big issue here is the management of evaporation of moisture. So home composting is organizing and managing organic material so that it biologically decomposes. And the decomposition that happens transforms the organic material to finished compost, as you can see in the lower right picture there. And this is all done by naturally occurring microorganisms in the presence of air and moisture. So let's consider the plant nutrient cycle with specific reference to the desert. First of all, let's say that's an apple tree there in the picture. So right now it's blossoming, and if the bees do their job, soon it will form apples and also begin to form its leaves. And then it will begin to carry on photosynthesis. And during photosynthesis, what happens is carbohydrates are formed. And so what's circulating around in the sap of that tree or any plant is a very sweet solution. But going back to the tree itself, so as those little apples form in the tree, then our desert winds come along and blow the tree, and some of those apples do what? They drop to the soil. And then during the growing season, twigs and branches fall from the tree and drop to the soil. Occasionally, some green leaves will come off of the tree and drop to the soil. And then in the fall, when the apples are ripe, if we don't harvest them, what are they going to do? They're going to drop to the soil. So nature is always trying to recycle nutrients back into the soil. The issue we have here in the desert is that because of our low moisture, everything that drops to the soil just dries up and blows around. So we get slow or no decomposition of those pieces of the plant that drop to the soil. So by home composting, we can compensate for that because we're going to be managing moisture and air in our composting setup. So this is the recipe that I alluded to earlier. We're going to combine organic material with water, give it air, give it time, and eventually we have a finished product. So if you look at inside the black square there, we divide the organic material into browns and greens. So you add the browns and greens together, and then dropping down, you add water and air, and then dropping all the way down to the corners, the macro and the microorganisms will be working on that organic substrate to produce a finished product. And this is the basic recipe for composting all over the planet. I'm going to define organics here in just a minute. So by organic material, I mean anything that was once alive. And that includes both plant and animals. So you see the pictures there, starting at the left, paper products, and then clippings from the garden, fruit and vegetable scraps from your kitchen, leaves from your trees, and a variety of animal manures. All that is what I'm talking about when I use the term organic material. So composters divide the organic material by their colors. And so we have greens and browns. The browns are usually dry and they have a preponderance of carbon in them. They provide microbial nutrition, but alone they decompose very slowly. The greens, on the other hand, are usually moist and they contain nitrogen. And this is important because the nitrogen provides microbial nutrition and protein for reproduction and cell wall formation. So when you combine the greens with the browns, then you have an appropriate diet or menu for microbial proliferation. And an easy way to think about this, for every 2 parts brown, add 1 part green. So once again, for every 2 parts brown, add 1 part green, if you have it, don't get stuck here. And that provides balanced microbial nutrition and decomposition happens. You see in the picture there, a mixture of greens and browns. You can still see the colors, but below the pitchfork there, you see decomposition has happened and the color has changed. So it's becoming more carbonaceous as decomposition occurs. There are some materials that are brown in color, but they do contain nitrogen, so they're actually in the green column. And that would be all manures and coffee grounds. So here's an idea of how you can combine things at home. Everything on the left is a brown and everything on the right is a green. So the browns, for example, are dry leaves and multiple paper products that we might have in our home. And then on the right are the greens, which would be any plant scraps that are kind of fresh and green. And then any vegetable and fruit scraps that you might have in your kitchen. So you could combine those in the ratio of 2 parts brown to 1 part green, and you will have a nice combination for microbial nutrition and things will go well. So people have questions about paper products, so let's go through those a little bit. And these are all browns, they're carbonaceous. So newspaper, egg carton, paper towel, paper napkins, tissue, paper bags, coffee filters, shredder paper, wrapping paper, cardboard, molded cardboard packaging, tea paper rolls, toilet paper rolls, cotton materials like Q-tips, balls, and menstrual pads. In the paper area, you're welcome to avoid anything that's glossy, colored, with a lot of dye in it, or anything that's coated with wax or plastic, or anything that's contaminated with chemicals, for instance, oil or paint. So if you're in doubt, just leave it out and do some research. So the following have come up over the years as to whether or not they can be added. Crushed eggshells, certainly. Moldy products, certainly. Mold is a decomposing organism, and that's what we want in our composting operation. Liquid leftovers like coffee, tea, soda, wine, and beer. And then to water your pie, you can repurpose wash water as long as it doesn't have any bleach in it. Now, those of us who do some sort of composting often have a container somewhere in the house. Often it's on the kitchen counter, and bring to your attention, these are for short-term storage. These are not composting containers or just holding containers. So you need to empty them regularly and frequently to avoid odors. Odors occur when you compact moist organic material, and then it goes from an aerobic situation to an anaerobic situation. And the anaerobic bacteria are the ones that create the odors. So try to avoid that. And if you have that container in your house somewhere, remember, you can add all of your used paper products to it. If you're using the so-called bio bags, pierce them and dump the contents into your compost operation. The bags themselves decompose quite slowly, so just be patient with them. And then before you take the container out to your composting operation, add some water to it. So you're not only adding organic material, but water at the same time. So in this area, we have a lot of horse manure, especially in corrales. So fresh vegetarian animal manures are a high nitrogen source. All animal manures have salts in them, so it's good to dilute them with other organics as we normally do in composting. And if you're going to use manures, be aware of the fact that there could be residual herbicides and residual vermicides in them. So in the winter months, we're sometimes short on greens. So I like to go over this. We're moving out of winter right now, but sources are turf grass, weeds without seeds, or if you're doing any cover cropping in the winter, you can clip the crop and that will be a nice green source. Of course, kitchen scraps, which are fruit and vegetables, are greens. Coffee, hair, feather, and furs are greens. All manures, including urine and bedding. The bedding is not a green, but when it's saturated with urine, it kind of becomes a green. And then alfalfa, feather, and cottonseed meals, fish hydrolysate, and urine. Those are all greens. Right now, London rocket is beginning to grow, and some of them I notice even have seed heads on them. But that's an excellent source of green at this time of year. So if you have some, just snip off the seed head, and then the rest of the plant you can chop up and add to your composting operation. So what should we not add? Well, in general, diseased plants or weeds with seeds. Wood ash is inorganic and alkaline. If you want to add wood ash, I would do it very sparingly, maybe a half a cup every 5 inches or so. If you do outdoor grilling, any charcoal with accelerants in it, because it's got a petrochemical in it. Okay, these are the ones that everybody gets excited about: meat, fish, dairy, lard, margarine, oil, and nut butters. The reason, those are all organic and they will decompose. The reason they're on the don't add list is because they have scents or odors that may attract critters. So that's why they're on the list. They are all organic. And if you choose to add them, that is your choice and it's your business. I've been adding, and we're talking about small amounts here, you know, a tablespoon of margarine, a little bit of oil, some leftover turkey bones at Thanksgiving time. Those are no problem, only if you don't think they are a problem. It all is up to you. Any chemically treated wood products, dog, cat, pig, and pet bird manure, chicken is okay. The reason dog, cat, pig, and pet bird is because those animals have diseases which are potentially, but not very commonly, can be communicated to humans. So if you want to decompose or compost any of those manures, I would suggest you use hot process and then use the end product on ornamentals rather than on edible plants. Glossy colored or wax paper, we already talked about that. Anything organic, it doesn't hurt the process. It'll just sit there. So metal, glass, plastic, synthetic fibers, styrofoam, and as much as possible, avoid pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and vermicides. So people bring up these questions regarding additions. And these are not required for the process to start or to continue. So they're not required. Soil additions are not required, but they're okay to add. Composting worms are not required, but you sure may add them if you like. Manures are not required. It is a choice of the individual. Compost starters are not required. It's a choice of the individual. And you will see in some of the old composting books to add lime, and that refers to operations in the eastern part of the United States where they have very acidic conditions, but not here in the desert. So our work as composting is managing the variables that are in the recipe. And then the other aspect of this is to harvest or collect your finished compost on a regular basis so you know that the process is fulfilling itself. So let's talk about the variables a little bit, and we'll go through these more as we go along. We want to maintain moisture in the setup at about 50 to 60%, and that's at all times, and that's our biggest challenge here in the desert. Temperature is going to be variable depending on what process you choose. We'll get to that in a minute. We need airflow in there, and to get that, I'm going to suggest you use coarse bulking material, and I'll go over with that with you in just a minute. If you're not familiar with coarse bulking material, I would suggest you educate yourself about it because it will avoid a lot of issues in the future. And then, of course, we have the brown and the green mix, which I already talked about. We'll talk about particle size, and that smaller decomposes better. The pH in an aerobic composting operation self-adjusts. So you don't have to worry too much about that unless you were to add something that's very alkaline, like a lot of wood ashes, which is why we recommend that you don't do that. So the time to the end product of whatever process that you're using is predicated on managing all of these variables, and we'll tease them apart here as we go along. So moisture is very important. The books say 50 to 60% throughout the process. So what does that mean? Okay, I compare 50 to 60% moisture similar to the moisture content of freshly brewed coffee grounds. So moist, but not dripping wet. So if you don't brew coffee, then you could take a tea bag, squeeze it out, and then open it up. And the moisture level you have in those tea leaves is similar to the moisture you want in your composting operation at all times. So our biggest challenge is to manage evaporation. So we're going to cover the top of our compost pile. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Anything that you add that's dry, for instance, paper products or cardboard, if you soak it first before you put it in, that will be helpful. So add moist materials, then keep the moisture in there and sprinkle with water as necessary to maintain that moisture level. We need moisture in a composting operation because the microorganisms, which are the heavy lifters here, can only function in a thin film of moisture that's on the organic material. It's within that thin film that they're able, in a sense, to move around because they don't have legs. Some of them have a flagellum, but it's within that moisture that they secrete the enzymes which transform the organic material to a finished product. So if your compost operation goes dry, it slows down or it stops. So I mentioned the size of the materials you put in. So you see the gentleman is raking leaves there sometime in the fall. And with leaves, it's really helpful if you can smash them up or grind them up a little bit and then moisturize them in a bucket or a wheelbarrow and then add them in because they're already moisturized. So the take-home message is that smaller decomposes better. So that means that anything you're going to add, make it smaller than it originally was. You can bring it down to, for instance, a 1-inch size if you want to. You can go all the way down to sawdust if you want to, but most people are not going to do that. Okay, here we get to coarse bulking, which may be new to some of you. And as I said earlier on, if you understand this concept, it will really benefit your composting operation. So what do we have here? We have pine cones, sticks and twigs, corn cobs, wood chips, and stalks from corn or sunflowers. So this is bulk. And what this does is it decreases compaction of the other organics that you're going to put in there. It provides fluffiness for your setup. And this helps convective airflow throughout the pile. And this stuff is woody and it's not going to decompose at the same rate as your other products. And that's okay because it's a space holder in the pile. So coarse bulking is useful in desert composting and is a necessity in static composting, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then because they don't decompose at the same rate as your other materials, then we're going to screen them out when we collect our finished product and then reuse them all over again. Some pictures are coming up. So you see the coarse material is added to this compost bin. Now, some of those sticks are a little bit bigger than I would recommend. Something about the size of your biggest finger works really well. But this is what happens if you look on the left there. Remember that in photosynthesis, carbohydrates are made, and then those end up in the plant material that we add to our composting operation. So when you transform a carbohydrate or break it up, what happens? Energy is released in the form of heat. It could be just a little bit of heat or it could be a lot of heat. But in any case, it causes convective aeration because what does warm air do? It goes up. But this is only going to happen in a real predictable way if you bulk as you build. So let's look at that. Whoop. Sorry. So this is a cutaway of a composting operation on the right. It's already been built. But if you look at the bottom there, the first thing that goes into that bin is 6 to 12 inches of coarse bulking material, and then your greens and browns. And after 5 inches or 6 inches of greens and browns, then add another 2 to 4 inches of coarse bulking material. So the take-home message is bulk as you build your pile. And then always cover the top of the pile to decrease evaporative loss from the top. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is a graphic illustration of what happens in a compost operation when you add coarse bulking material. So if you look at the picture there, the blue arrows going upward is the air movement in the pile. And that's secondary, that's convective airflow, and that is created by coarse bulking as you build. So if this concept is new to you, play with it a little bit, think about it, look at the pictures, and I think you'll understand why coarse bulking is very helpful, especially in static composting operations, which are coming up. So as I said, when you collect your finished compost from your bin or what have you, the coarse bulking will still be there. So I suggest that you sift it out and then put it in a bucket or something, and then you can use it all over again. So when you get this coarse bulking material into your system, you'll just keep using it for several years because it won't decompose at the same rate as your other organics that you're adding. So if you purchase compost, also you will find that it has some residual wood chips in it. And if you want to add a finer product to your garden soil, then you can sift that too, and then use those wood chips that came in the compost bag as a mulch around your plants, or you can add it to your own composting operation. And you can use as a sifter one of those plastic containers that you see in all the big box stores, or you can spread hardware cloth over a container and then kind of move it back and forth, and the fine finished compost will drop through and the bulky stuff will remain on the top. So other helpers in the decomposition process are a variety of insects, and they like a dark, moist environment that's somewhat undisturbed because that's where their food is, and they stay where the food is. They're called detritivores because they're eating that organic material. They're then defecating in the composting operation, and so they're making the organic smaller. And some of these insects eat each other, so they're adding to the biology. So they're very useful to the process. As I mentioned earlier, microbial inoculants are not required for the operation to begin or to sustain itself, but some people do like to add them, and you're welcome to do so. It is your choice. If you want an easy to have inoculant, it is compost itself. So as you're building your pile, you can add a cup or so of your finished compost, just sprinkle it in there, and you will have inoculated your pile with a microbial load. So there are two big divisions in the composting world. One is the cold or the cool process, and one is the hot process. So you can see the lady turning a hot pile down below there, and then the cool or cold process, the young lady is adding to her compost bin, and that's usually a static process. We'll go through each one of those one by one. I will say that for urban, suburban backyards, the cold or the cool process is probably a common choice. Of the two processes, there are two management methods. One is to manage your compost in a static way. That means no turn, no churn. And that's often the cold process. And this is really useful in urban, suburban yards. The active management process involves turning and churning. And this is often done with a hot process. And I know some of you have probably read composting books that say you have to turn your compost. When somebody says that, they are leaving out about 50% of composting operation planet-wide. It's a jaded approach to composting. It's an incomplete approach to composting. So I'm going to discuss static and cold composting now. So the role model for this type of composting is what happens in nature. When I started out, I talked about organic material dropping to the soil where it decomposes. So on the left there is a moist forest floor. And you probably would find that if you went into the Jemez Canyon or some of the canyons in the Sandia Mountains. Down here in the valley, you won't find that very much. We have to recreate it. So this is fungal and microbial decomposition on the forest floor. Here's my point. Turning is not required. So here you have decomposition happening on the soil, and nature doesn't go out there with a pitchfork and turn it, nor does she go out there with a thermometer and measure the heat level. This is naturally occurring decomposition, and this is what we're trying to recreate in a cold composting setup. So the cold composting process is any decomposition process which does not follow the specific guidelines for hot composting. So I'm defining it by elimination. If you're not following the guidelines for hot, then everything else is cold. Cold process mimics nature's way, as I just showed you in the picture. This may be static or passive. That means no turning. It's your choice. I'm not telling you not to turn anything. I'm just telling you that turning is not required for decomposition to happen. That's a miscommunication of information in the composting universe. So static cold composting is a frequent choice for urban, suburban composters, especially seniors, because this is so straightforward and no turning is required. Turning compost, it requires a lot of upper body strength. Varies with the ambient air temperature, so it will swing from summer to winter in the internal temperature of that pile. So it'll slow down a little bit in the summer. It'll start to pick up now. I just got a message that my internet connection was faulty. So let's see what happens here. Okay, continuing on with cold process composting, the time to the end product. Well, if you put something in today, it'll be ready in 6 to 12 months from now. It'll be fully decomposed. And you have to have that range because we have to factor in wintertime temperatures. This is often occasional additions of whatever organics you have available. So I call it dump and run, dump and done. And coarse bulking is added and moisture is maintained at 50%. Now, when you add something to your composting operation, do not compact it. Just dribble it in there, sprinkle it in there, and leave it alone. If you push on the top, trying to get more in there, you're going to compress all the air spaces, and that's not recommended because you need the air in there. So here's a run through. Collect your organic material. Having a container is quite useful. We're going to discuss containers in just a minute. Chop before you drop. Bulk as you build. Dump and run is a static method. If you want to turn it, turn and tumble. Make yourself happy. Maintain uniform moisture at all times. If possible, put your composting bin in the shade in the summer. And then remember to harvest regularly or to collect your finished compost regularly so that you know what you got. So see what Dad's doing there on the left. He's added some greens, he's added some browns, and the browns, he's added his bulking material. He's chopped before he dropped, and he's good to go. Then 6 to 12 months later, he will harvest what went in today from the bottom of that particular bin. So what's happening in a compost bin? And this applies to all bins, not just the one you see in the picture there. So this is a cycle. So what goes in today will end up at the bottom about 6 to 12 months later as finished product. So you can see at the bottom there, that nice chocolatey brown area, that's the finished product, which above it is still decomposing. It isn't done yet. So when you remove the finished product from the bottom, what happens? The top drops down, and that gives you more space on the top to add more material. So when you get this cycle going and you keep it going, you have an ongoing process. So I've mentioned containers many times. So let's look at a variety of containers, because they help us to organize, contain, and manage the organic material so that it decomposes. And notice the young lady there. This is a sales picture. You can see she's dumping stuff into that bin, but number one, the bin is already too full. Number two, she didn't chop up that banana peel before she put it in. And I would encourage her to do that in the future. So let's look at containment methods for the organic material. First of all, on top of the soil, that'll be bins, sheets, piles, and bags. And then actually putting the organic material into the soil. And we'll look at pits, trenches, and a container in the soil. So containers, in my opinion, are easy to add to and easy to harvest from or collect from usually. They're neat and tidy, so that's important for urban, suburban households. They facilitate air and moisture management, and that's important here in the desert. They're movable. There are many styles and many choices. They're a one-time expense, but you may have as many as you want. They reduce flying insects, critters, and predators. So here are a couple of manufactured plastic bins. I call them towers because they're upright, and they all are similarly designed. They have a sliding door on the bottom, which opens up so you can collect your finished product. And they have a flip top on the top so that you can add to the composting operation. And they all have open bottom drainage. So I picked this bin on the left here because it is a bin that is exactly what you do not want in the desert. It's too porous. It's got too many holes in it. Everything you put in that bin in a desert will dry up. You can fix it by over taping all of those holes except for a few at the bottom of the bin for air intake. So the point here is, in the desert, we need low porosity bins that go in the shade in the summer, and that have the holes covered. We're going to cover the top of the pile. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Sprinkle to maintain moisture, and avoid compacting any addition that you make. Just sprinkle it in. And all of these have bottom drainage. We don't want soup at the bottom of our composting operation. Now, if you have an issue with tree roots growing into your compost bin, then you can elevate the bin on something like a pallet that you see in the bottom right there. So you would lay the pallet down and then cover the top of the pallet with either a fine mesh screen or a weed blocking fabric, and then place your bin on top of that. Then the weeds will not be able to grow up into your bin. Um, Plastic tumblers, are, some of these come already elevated as the one on the left. And this is kind of nifty, especially if you're a senior and you don't want to bend over, or you're anybody and don't want to bend over. And then this elevates the bin above the ground, so you may get less insects getting in there, and mice will have a hard time getting up in there, as well as snakes will have a hard time getting up in there. And this also will help you avoid tree roots or shrub roots if you have them. And then the bin on the right is also a tumbler. And if you want to elevate that, you can just put some pumice blocks underneath it and it will lift it up off of the soil for you. And both of these bins are movable. So let's compare the stationary tower on the left, which is a popular bin, and the tumbler bin, which is sometimes popular also. Once again, the stationary tower on the left has an opening at the top where you add your organic material, and then a sliding door at the bottom where you harvest or collect your finished product. When the bin is in operation, that lower door is closed, okay? Otherwise, you would get a lot of evaporation and you would get your product tumbling out when you don't want it to. Okay, let's go over to the tumbler. Undecomposed organic material to that which is already decomposed, and you're tumbling it. So it's all getting mixed in together. And this is a problem people have in identifying the finished product because it's all blended in. So what you have to do with a tumbler is about every 3 months, take small amounts of everything you have in there, sift out the finished product, and then what is undecomposed goes back in again, and you just keep the system running. If you don't do that, you're going to be confused. We have quite a bit of information on our website on using tumbler bins. And on the handout that you received, it's number 4. So you can go to our website and get that information. It's called Tips for Tumblers. One thing the tumbler people don't tell you is, and I think it's very useful, is to add small amounts of coarse bulking material to the tumbler. Now, you don't need as much as you would in a static upright pile, maybe just a handful every now and then, but that keeps everything in there fluffy, and that's good. And then the other thing is people overstuff these bins, and then when they turn them, nothing up against the side. So avoid overstuffing a tumbler. Maintain moisture in all seasons, and I encourage you to harvest from that bin every 3 to 6 months so that you get some finished product out of there. Now, you can make your own composting bins, and once again, on our website, nmcomposters.org, you can find a section there on the left menu on how to make these bins, which are pictured here. Okay, so you can make one out of a plastic trash can, and all you need in the desert is holes on the bottom for drainage and air intake, and then just a few holes on the side for air intake. That's it for a desert bin. If you do what is pictured on the upper right there, that's a sieve, and that'll work in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, but it won't work here. Everything you put in there will dry out. Another container is made from pellets, and that's a great idea. But you can see that everything that's in that pellet bin is all dried out. So what we want to do is line the inside of the bin with a tarp, as you see on the right there, and then that will be a nice snug desert composting bin. If you want to build your own wood bin, then look at how snug those slats are in the bin there on the lower right. Remember, Preservation of moisture is one of the most important tasks we have in desert composting. So here are some snug wooden bins. Notice that those slats are fitting closely next to each other. There's no gaps in there whatsoever, and they work really well in the desert. Stack blocks may be used for a compost bin, any size you want it to be. They work quite well. If you look at the picture on the left, you see everything in those bins is all dried up. That's not composting, that's storage. Okay, if you want to use one of these bins, then do what you see in the lower right corner there. When you're finished making your addition or whatever you're going to do in your pile, then cover it up with a tarp, and that'll keep moisture in there. Wire fencing bins are very inexpensive, but they have to be customized for the desert. So let's look at that. So these are all wire bins. Once again, the one on the far left, we have pictured in our homemade bin section on our website, nmcomposters.org. So as a liner, you can use a tarp, as the young lady is doing there. You can use cardboard. I don't think it works as well, but it is an option. And on the one on the far left, I used some plastic bags because I had them. I was getting horse manure in them. They only last for about a year, so they're not very sturdy, but I repurposed them for that period of time. And they work quite well to keep moisture in the bin. Surely you can make a bin out of bales. It can be any configuration you want it to be, any width, any depth, any height. And once again, when you're finished working in there, cover the top of the pile. Otherwise, the convective air is going to move right up out of the pile and it will dry up. Some people like this open pile method. I don't recommend it in the desert. But if you're going to do that, when you're finished working with it, I would cover it up with the tarp just as you see in the picture there. And you will get airflow under there because this is not a hermetic seal on the tarp. It's just battened down so it doesn't blow away. In the lower left picture there, that's a hot compost pile. So you can see the water vapor coming off of the pile. And even in a cold pile, if you don't cover the top of it, this is what's going to happen. All the moisture is going to go up and out. So let's talk about layered composting. This is a non-container method, unless you have a raised bed, and that would be your container. So this can be done on top of your pile. Often this is started in the fall when there's nothing growing in your bed, or even if it is, you can compost around it. So you would add layers of organic material. Each one of those layers is moisturized. The gardener on the right there used a layer of manure, then a layer of newspaper, then a layer of leaves, and she just kept building that up till he was satisfied. And that was his layered compost on top of his soil. So the idea is that this is going to decompose and amend the soil right where you put it. Because we have so much wind and very little rain, sometimes what I do when I do this method is I put a tarp over it and then lightly batten down the tarp with stones, and that helps to keep moisture in the pile over the winter months. Another method is to add your organic material directly to the soil where it will decompose. So you see the picture of the chopped vegetables in the lower left corner. That is blended with the soil and then covered up. And decomposition time of that organic material depends on moisture and soil temperature. So I would give that anywhere from 3 to 8 months to decompose, and it's going to depend on soil temperature. Then you may actually put a container, an open bottom container, right into the soil. That way you don't have to dig every time you want to add something to the soil. So there is an open container on the upper left there. It does have a little red cover. And then that container, you dig a hole, slip it into the hole. And then the soil around the container acts as an insulation for both heat and cold. So this is operable in all seasons here in the high desert. Then you can add your organic material where it will decompose. And if you want to, you can add composting worms to this container. Now, when decomposition is complete in there, you have two options. You can lift the container up out of the hole, at which point the finished compost will drop in the hole and you will have amended the soil right in that place. Or you can scoop the finished compost out of there, use it wherever you want, and then restart using that same container all over again. Another easy method is bag and weight. So in the fall, you, if possible, shred your leaves, then put them in a wheelbarrow or a bucket and soak them for a little bit, and then spoon them into a plastic bag, tie up the bag, put it in a sunny location, and then in the spring, you'll have what is called leaf mold, which makes an excellent mulch for your springtime garden. Another method is a closed bucket method called the bokashi method. And bokashi is a Japanese word that means fermented material. And these kits, these bokashi composting kits, are available online. Amazon sells them as a kit. And these may be useful if you live in a small space like an apartment, and or if you don't like insects, because nothing gets in that bucket that you don't put in. So the first stage, you add your organic material to the bucket, and you do have to add the bokashi mix, which is a blend of a specific set of microorganisms which influence the fermentation that goes on in the bucket. And then after the bucket is full and everything is fermented for about 2 weeks, then that bucket is dumped into your garden soil, blended in with the soil, and then it decomposes there in your garden soil. So this method is kind of pre-composting. Worm composting is very straightforward. And Mary Applehoff, who helped to champion this, excuse me, Mary has passed on now, but she lived in Michigan. So most of her setups were indoors. Here in central New Mexico, we can have our worms outdoors with a little bit of protection, and they do just fine. And that's a whole different class. I'll just bring it up for the sake of completeness. So here's a friend of mine in Albuquerque. He's a very neat gardener, as you can see. He's got his composting operations. He's got several different bins here. He's got a tower bin, excuse me. He's got a tower bin, a tumbler, and then some wire round bins that are lined with plastic and or cardboard. So you see how organized and simple this can be, if you want it to be. So you can choose your own organizing method, both either a bin, a pit, a sheet, or a bag, then a process. We've only been talking about cold so far. Then a management style. Mostly I focused on passive no-turn management, but you can turn anything you want. It's up to you. So active management would be turning and churning with coarse bulking material added, and that's usually the hot process, which we haven't discussed yet. It's coming up. Or let everything be passive, static with coarse bulking material. That's often the cold process. So let's review the variables that we discussed right from the get-go. Remember, the time cycle from what you put in today to when it will be fully decomposed depends on how you manage the variables. Once again, moisture must be maintained at 50%. Temperature is going to be variable. Sometimes you have no control of that unless you're doing hot composting. And we're going to get airflow by using coarse bulking material. And then if possible, we're going to combine greens and browns. And then we're going to chop everything up, make everything smaller before we add it. And then the insects and the worms will help the process in breaking things down. So what gets added or what gets left out to a composting operation is your business and it's your choice. If you're not sure or you have concern, then research the item. And you can send us questions, including questions from today at compost-questions@nmcomposters.org. You can send them in anytime you want. Just be as complete as you can with your question and put in your zip code so we know where you live. Or you can call your local extension office. So unpleasant odors are something that some people think compost has or always has. It's a totally inappropriate expectation. Compost operations should have a pleasant, earthy fragrance. If you have unpleasant odors, most likely they come from compaction of moist organic material, which will render that anaerobic. And it's the anaerobic rather than the aerobic macroorganisms or microorganisms that create those smelly gases that we want to avoid. So blend your greens and browns, and then here it is again, bulk as you build, and then you won't get compaction, and then you won't get odors. And always avoid standing liquid in any composting operation. They should drain. If you have issues with predators, and some people who live in the East Mountains do have these issues, then you have some choices. You could do an indoor worm bin or the bokashi bucket method, which I just recommended or I just spoke about. Or you can bury your organic material in deep pits, at least 12 to 24 inches deep. Then these animals will not smell those things. So primarily, if you have these animal issues, avoid scented food scraps, meat, dairy, in your piles or containers, either indoors or outdoors. If you don't like insects, this is a tricky one because they are a part of the process. You can bury your organics deep in the soil, as I've described. You can use the bokashi bucket method, which is closed. You can do an indoor worm bin. They're somewhat closed. Raised tumbler bins may have less insects. You can cover the holes in any compost bin with a screen fabric or barrier to try to keep the insects out. But my experience is they get in anyway. If you're working in a small space or you want to do a composting operation in a small space, once again, the worm bin is a possibility. The bokashi bucket in the upper right corner. You can do pit or trench composting outdoors, or you can do bag and weight. And those bags take up very little space. You could put them in your garage if you want to. So we've talked about mostly the cold process. We're done with that. So I'm going to go on for completion to the hot process. And this won't take much time, but I just want you to understand that the formula for hot process is exactly the same as the formula for cold. The difference is its management of the hot process is a little bit more complex. And sometimes it's called fast composting, hot composting, or a thermophilic composting. So you see the lady on the left there is turning that compost pile. It's obviously a hot pile, and the ambient air temperature is lower than the temperature in the pile. So you see that water vapor is condensing and forming kind of like a steam above the pile. Where does the heat come from in a hot compost pile? It comes from the breakdown of carbohydrates. The breakdown of carbohydrates. That's where the heat comes from. only indirectly from the sun, because it was sunshine that made the photosynthesis cycle happen. And that bit of sun energy is captured in the carbohydrates. And when the enzymes break them down in your compost pile, then they release heat. In this situation, they release a lot of heat. So how does the hot process differ from the cold? First of all, this is a batch. It's not intermittent additions once in a while. It's a batch that's mixed all at one time. And the minimum size recommended for this batch is a cubic yard of organic material, which is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. Oh, that's quite a big size. And you can go all the way up to a height of 4 feet. After 4 feet in height, you start to get weight problems and compaction. And then hot composters pay attention to the recipe of the blend of browns and greens. So for every 2 parts brown, they want to be sure to have 1 part green, because if you don't have the right amount of green in there, the microbes are not going to proliferate. And we rely on that proliferation of microbes to break down provide the enzymes, which are going to break down the carbohydrates, which are creating the heat. And this is the one that, in my estimation, does need to be turned and churned, because you want all aspects of that pile to reach a target temperature of about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. When you do that, then you bump off or kill any pathogens and any weed seeds that might have ended up in there. So all commercial composting operations use the hot process because they want to be sure to kill pathogens and weed seeds, because they're going to sell the product to the public. And for my hot process, I turn my pile every 7 to 14 days until it's finished, until I get finished product. So what's happening in a hot pile? The moist heat is softening the organics, and it's also destroying pathogens and seeds. We sprinkle a hot pile before turning and churning it, because when you turn it, you might get spores from the microorganisms coming up into the air. And by wetting it before you turn it, you decrease that. We're going to turn, and if our pile temperature is dropped, then we add more nitrogen in the form of greens. We add more water if it's necessary, and we just keep doing that until the finished compost is evident. And then the hot process compost should be cured, set aside and cured for about 6 weeks. And that's the cold phase of hot composting. So those of us who do hot process often use this 3-bin method. It's not required, but it's very convenient. And these are called the New Zealand box. And you can see the one on the right there is a desert New Zealand box. It's very snug. And you can see that the top of the pile is covered. So what we do is, if we start out in bin 1, then when the pile has met our temperature criteria, then we let it cook for 7 to 14 days, and then flip it with a fork into the next bin. Let that bin come up to temperature, let it cook for 7 to 14 days, and then flip it into the next bin, at which point we're almost done with the process. So you can see how different this process is from the cold static process. This one requires quite a bit of work, requires upper body strength, and it's often not a choice for senior citizens or for urban, suburban dwellers, but you may do it if you want to. So I've covered those two methods, both hot and cold, static and active. So the finished product, compost, is humus in the making. So compost itself is a stable mixture of compounds containing carbon, nitrogen, and plant nutrients. Really important for us here in the desert is that that particle can absorb 80% of its mass in water. So in this drought that we're in now, if you amend your garden soil with compost, then it's going to act as a sponge and hold the water that you get from rain or from irrigation, and then release it in the plant zone as necessary. Another important point is that the compost buffers the soil pH. In general, our desert soils have a high pH, and we don't want that to go higher. So by adding compost, you kind of keep that pH in the range of 8, or maybe it'll drop a little bit lower toward neutral. So finished compost is the end product of microbial decomposition of organic material. It contains dormant, living, and dead microorganisms. And there's usually some residual undecomposed organic material. And of course, locked up in that particle are the residual plant nutrients of the plants that you put in to decompose. So you're recycling those nutrients. What does it look like? You look at the picture on the right there. It looks like chocolate cake crumbs after the bulking has been removed. You're unable to identify the original ingredients. You don't see the apple core in there anymore. You don't see the coffee grounds in there anymore. You don't see fruit and vegetable scraps anymore. It's all transformed. It has an earthy, pleasant fragrance. It no longer generates heat. And compost has a sample of compost will have an NPK value of approximately 1% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, and 1% potassium. So compost is sold as a soil amendment, but it is also a gentle, natural fertilizer. If you want to use your compost unsifted, as you see in the picture on the right there, you surely can use it as a top mulch around your perennial plants, like an apple tree or something like that's been in the ground for a while. If you want to incorporate it into your garden soil, I would suggest you sift it and get out the coarse bulking and the undecomposed materials. And then sometimes you will find grubs in your compost. Those should be removed before you add that to your garden soil. You can euthanize them and then put them right back into your compost bin and let them be part of your composting operation. Of course, you can make a compost tea from freshly done compost if you like. That is a long discussion, which we can have another time. So how do you use compost as a soil amendment? Well, first of all, as I said earlier, I like to sift my compost. And as you see the young lady there, she's spreading it out on top of a raised bed there. And then the gentleman in the lower right-hand corner has spread out his compost and he's scratching it in with a tine rake. All you have to do is scratch it in about 3 inches into your topsoil. Then you're going to water it in, and then you're going to put mulch on top to keep the moisture in there. If your soil is compacted, you can use a tine rake, or a garden spade on the upper left there, or a broad fork to break up that compaction, and then spread out your compost, then water it in, then scratch it in, water it in. Then you can either plant and then mulch. And you can add compost both in the spring and in the fall. And don't forget, you can add finished compost to your potted plants too. Just some health and safety. When you're working with soil or working with compost, if you have a wound, be sure you cover it up and then wear gloves. Avoid touching your face and your mucous membranes with contaminated hands, because this is the way microbes get into your body. Sprinkle compost if you're going to be turning or churning it before you do that. Consider a tetanus booster. We can get those every 10 years. And of course, scrub your hands and wash your vegetables before you consume them. So to summarize, follow the science, the recipe we started out with, tweak the variables, organize your organic material, chop before you drop, bulk as you build, maintain moisture in all seasons, drape the top of the pile, and adjust your expectations. This does take time. And while I'm on draping the top of the pile, let me, you see the lady is adding compost, I'm sorry, she's adding organic material to her compost bin. When she has finished doing that, wherever the top of the pile is inside that bin, my suggestion is you drape it with either a piece of plastic, a piece of cardboard that's cut to fit, a piece of tarp, an old rug, or 4 inches of leaves, because you want to prevent upward evaporation of moisture. For me, plastic works the best. I just repurpose a piece of plastic. It's really excellent. And then if you go out there in the morning, remember our temperature drops at night. And when it reaches the dew point, that moisture that's coming up off of the pile is going to condense. And you can lift up that piece of plastic and you will see plastic droplets there. And those are going to drop right back into the soil. I'm sorry, into the compost. So decide what might work for you or your family. Pick a way, get started, and practice. This is experiential. You do it, you learn it. Be patient, read and research. Contact us with your questions, compost-questions at nmcomposters.org. So here's a summary that's also posted on our website. Use low porosity bins and containers. Block the holes in any plastic manufactured bins. You can use a good quality duct tape or a caulk. Always cover the top of the pile and then the top of the bin itself. Wet dry materials before you add them. Sprinkle to maintain 50% moisture throughout the process. Place the operation on the soil in the shade in the summer months. Chop, shred, cut before you drop it in. Add what you have on hand. It's all going to decompose if it was once alive and it's now dead. Mixing browns with greens is helpful. Avoid compaction of additions. Add coarse bulking material as you build. So if you're new to composting and you're undecided, while you're waiting, you can collect your organic material and donate it to a local community garden. And that way you will be recycling that organic material rather than wasting it. So we've been talking about a science-based art form, and the management is tweaking the variables as we've gone through. So if you follow the science, follow the recipe, then you can do whatever suits you. And that is your own composting art. By doing composting, you're going to help nature recycle plant nutrients to produce a useful soil amendment, which is going to sequester carbon in the soil, thereby avoiding the landfill. And for me, this is a tremendous sense of accomplishment. So once again, our website, nmcomposters.org. Questions, there's the address. You can send them anytime you want. And I hope that you've picked up some new information today. If you have any questions about it, we can have a discussion now, and or you can email us at your convenience. So Sandy, I am done and you can take over.
Okay, thank you, John. That was an amazing presentation. We really appreciate it so much.